Wonderful.
Now, let me trash talk Lincoln a little bit before you
This is being recorded, you understand?
I didn't say that.
Wasn't me.
I only mention it in case Lincoln listens to it and trash talks you back. We're gonna hope that Lincoln will not be technically challenged this evening, as has happened in the past.
Let's go ahead and talk for a second. And then I'll bring you
All right. So I'll ask you a question. Which of you did more of the heavy lifting in Old Bones? Was it you or was it Lincoln?
I think it was me a little bit. Since the idea originated with me, the initial idea, I kind of took the lead on that book.
Okay. There's some wonderful science in this book, which you will find out when you read it. It is a thriller, but there's a lot of science base in the book, which I thought was completely fascinating. Archaeology, genetics, medicine.
Lincoln, you can come online now. We're all waiting for you.
We are. Where are you? Are you getting a martini? There you are. Yay! Hi. It's so nice to see you again. I always feel you're like the Great Oz, you know, just behind the curtain, but you're not in a balloon.
But Lincoln, you haven't shaved. You look like a dog. What would your mother think?
She'd think I'm handsomer than you.
Okay, so the sound is working. Now we know. All righty. So, Lincoln, we're gathered here to talk about Old Bones, which is your new series start, which I think is absolutely fabulous. And I asked Doug who did more of the heavy lifting on this book, you or him?
Well, you know, Old Bones are a lot lighter than New Bone, so no, the lifting wasn't really all that difficult. This is a tough crowd tonight. I don't know. I would be remiss if I didn't say that Doug didn't do most of the heavy lifting on this one. He got the idea. I mean, we both knew about the Donner Party. It came into fruition in a very similar way as to our book Riptide, where I called him and said, "Hey, I think we should write a book about the Oak Island," and he said, "Treasure." And you know, Doug said, "You know, I'm reviewing this great book on the Donner Party. You know, and I think that would make a fantastic story." And you know, he knew a lot more about it than I did. Living, you know, in Santa Fe and spending so much time on horseback around the West. But I knew the bare bones, so to speak, of the story, and I thought it would be just exactly our cup of tea. And especially for the fact, since we were looking for a new series to launch, this seemed the ideal way to do it.
Well, I'd say that that's entirely accurate. You know, both Lincoln and I come from archaeological backgrounds. Link's grandmother was a really well-known archaeologist, and he'll tell you about her in a second, but her name was Nora. Oh. And my aunt was a very famous archaeologist, a Roman archaeologist, and so both of us have this wonderful interest in archaeology. And with the Donner Party, we realized that the two of the Donner camps had been excavated by archaeologists, and they'd found some really weird things. You all know about the Donner Party, the cannibalism and everything. So our idea, which we arrived at after only about 20 minutes of talk, was that there's a third camp called the Lost Camp of the Donner Party, and that Nora, essentially her assignment is to find this lost camp and excavate it. And so that's sort of how the novel begins.
So, Lincoln, you've written several books on your own, which I really enjoyed, with an enigmologist, but they've had some archaeological or at least interesting location elements. especially love the one in the Sudan in the swamp. But so you're relatively familiar with this kind of thing, and it happens in the Pendergast books too, right?
That's right. I became fascinated with it from an early age because my as Doug mentioned, my grandmother was Nora Kuby was not only an archaeologist, but she was a painter and a novelist and a nonfiction writer. And I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the first book series, the first book of trains, the first book of submarines. Well, she wrote the first book of archaeology and illustrated it. She knew a lot of the famous archaeologists, like the guy who excavated Masada, for example. I was spending one summer at her house during college, and I was really bored and just wasn't happy to be out in the middle of the woods in Nelson, New Hampshire, and there was really nothing there in between Marlborough and Peterborough. And so to try and excite me and do something besides shoot skeet all day, she got in touch with somebody she knew at a university nearby who was doing a dig with their students for the summer, and they were digging up a colonial cabin that they knew existed somewhere in this little hollow, but they didn't know exactly where. And so she dragged me over there one day. I was a typical bratty teenager, and the director, as a favor to her, gave me a trowel and a whisk and let me just go off in a corner where it wouldn't cause any problems. And I began, whisking away, and within about 10 minutes, I had found this piece of iron that, I didn't think it meant anything, and I held it up, and first of all, I was told, in certain terms, not to hold it up, and then somebody else came and got it with gloves, and took it over, and there was this grand excitement, and I had found the door lock to the front door of the cabin, which allowed them suddenly to situate the cabin and figure out where it lay in the hollow. And so I got the stink eye from about 60 graduate students. I wandered on site one day and found, this the Holy Grail, and then was never seen again. But it was things like that, and then reading her books, and after her death, putting her memoirs together, which she would never let me see while she was alive. She was very, very canny about, her excavations of Camelot and Masada and other places. But after her death, I was given by my aunt what she planned to be her life story as an archaeologist, and I edited it and put it together for family members only, and that also helped me really cement my interest in the subject, which Doug and I explored in Thunder, and as you mentioned, Barbara has come up with some of my solo books, and really comes to the fore, probably more than any other book we've done in Old Bones.
It does, and you've just confirmed with that little speech the fact that nothing you do is ever ordinary, Lincoln. So Doug and I had a little chat before this program, and one of the things we talked about was that Agatha Christie is a pioneer in the archaeological detective. She was married to Max Mallowan, who is a famous archaeologist, her second husband, not the rat that left her, but the one that stayed. And he excavated, Doug reminded me, or you looked it up, right? Nimrud. Which is one of the Middle Eastern sites that you can see it in the British Museum, and I think some of it in the Pergamon. But she wrote, they came to Baghdad. She wrote several mysteries that involved archaeology. And remember what else we talked about? Because I thought it was so interesting about the country house murder aspect of an archaeological site.
Yeah, an archaeological dig is a bit like a closed house mystery. And especially in Old Bones, where the site that they find it's not a closed house, but it's a closed valley. And so everything happened in this valley everything, you know, and the mystery is there, and they know it's there, and that's what they're looking for, and it's very much like a closed house mystery that Agatha Christie might write. So
Sure.
archaeology is a lot like, archaeology is a lot like crime detection.
It does. It uses a lot of the same techniques, right?
It does, yeah. I mean, you're sifting through every little detail, looking for hairs and tiny clues at a crime scene, and that's exactly what you do at an archaeological dig as well. Is sift through everything. You're trying to put together, who did it, what were they doing, why did they do this? It's the same questions that archaeologists ask about a site that they're excavating is exactly what the police ask when they're doing a forensic analysis of a crime site.
Right.
The
So
difference is that in archaeology, when they find the murderer, they can't do anything about it.
Yeah, but I have to I have to tell you my archaeological story because it's a southwestern story that I don't think that Link is as aware of. I don't think I've ever mentioned this to him. But when I was a kid, I went to camp in Peru, New Mexico, which is not too far from the Arizona border. It's not far from Gallup. And I was 13 years old, and we excavated a little 4-room Pueblo ruin near Gallup. So we had this archaeologist come out from the University of New Mexico, and he was gonna excavate this little room, and we were gonna be his helpers. So we were starting to dig, and we excavated one of the rooms, and then we started digging in the midden heap, which is the trash heap. And we were going down, and we started uncovering these incredible 4 white bowls upside down. Just perfect. They hadn't even been broken. And so we were like brushing away on these things, and the archaeologist came over and said, look, we found 4 ancient Anasazi bowls. And he looked closer and he said, those aren't bowls. Those are skulls. Oh. Note the sutures. Well, this was about 1,000 times more exciting than bowls. 4 skulls placed looking in the 4 cardinal directions, with their bones attached. So 4 bodies have been buried in a cross-like, arrangement in the 4 directions. It's really amazing.
So there's a
Did
limit.
they ever explain why? Was there a religious significance to that, or what the purpose was of having them buried like that in the cardinal directions?
Well, they said they determined it was a secondary burial, so that these bodies had been dug up as bones and then reassembled in this grave, but they never could say why. And the skulls were Anasazi. They had that flattening. The babies are strapped to a cradle board and they flatten the back of the skull. So they were definitely ancient. But boy, as a 13-year-old, that made such an impression on me. I'm telling you, I'll never forget those skulls coming to light and brushing away the eye sockets, and it was so exciting.
Archie for life, right? So you have a limited number of suspects if you have a site that's completely contained, which is part of the whole Agatha Christie thing. There were only so many people at the country house. So tell us, who are the people that we're going to find in the lost camp? Who are they?
Well, the main characters. Well, of course, this is a Nora Kelly novel, and she's, as you may know, most of you probably know who she is. She was an archaeologist who first appeared in the Cabinet of Curiosities, working with Pendergast, and she's done a number of cases with him. She lost her husband, Bill Smith, back to a murderer, which became one of our novels. And so at the same time, there's another character who appears in this novel who Pendergast met when she was a rebellious teenager in Medicine Creek, Kansas, with purple hair, always in trouble, and he mentored her and he paid for her college education. She went to the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and then she did a couple of years in low-level law enforcement. Then she went to the FBI Academy, And she appears in this novel as a rookie FBI agent given a crappy case she's working for the Albuquerque office, and she's working on nothing but cold cases, and finally she's bugging her. In the FBI, when you become a new agent, there's a mentoring period where you're 2 years, you're ghosting. So you have an FBI agent who looks over you, an older one, sort of teaching you really how things work. So she bugs him, and finally he says, "All right, well, there's this case." She gets interested in this case, and anyway, finally she is given a little bit of opportunity to investigate. So she goes out to California and meets with Nora. The two have never met, and they don't like each other at all. And she says, "Well, there's some anomalies here in this archaeological investigation that you're conducting, and I need to question people, and I need to look at what you're doing," and so forth. And Nora does not like this at all. And so I better not talk anymore because I don't want to spoil anything. But some really mysterious things are happening, not just at this archaeological site, but in other areas of the country that are linked.
It was really a fun story for us to write because these two characters were characters that have played very important secondary roles in several of our books, but had rarely, if ever, brushed paths with each other. And in fact, I know they had not brushed paths, come to think of it. But Corey Swanson, for example, is a very strong-headed young woman, but we were able to balance it very well because even though she was strong-willed and kind of pig-headed in some ways, this was her first real assignment. So she was also intimidated. She had to act like the new FBI agent. She was in an environment she didn't know, although she does know a lot about forensics. She doesn't know a lot about necessarily Southwestern archaeology. And so it allowed us to keep the two women, the more mature Nora and the more feisty Corey, at very similar levels of tension with each other. And it really gave us a lot of chance to have some interaction, sparks fly, and also slowly show them beginning to respect each other as each one made discoveries of her own.
So what is the, quote, instigating incident? What is it that sends them off to the Sierras? Because this case, you don't get to just pick one. You have to actually have one come to you. And it's Nora, right, that gets the original assignment.
Yeah, a very good-looking man was the instigating factor. It was a fellow named Clive who comes up to Nora, and she starts to brush him off as just somebody annoying her while she's trying to finish up on a small dig, and he lets her know that he has found, after great length, he's obsessed with the Donner Party and the mystery of the lost camp, and he has found the journal of Tamsin Donner, the wife of the leader of the party, which gives not only a lot of credence to the myths of the lost camp, but it also begins to talk a lot about possible locations, very specific locations, and the fact that maybe other things besides just bones at that spot. And with that, Nora's ears perk up, and she realizes this is the dig possibly of a lifetime. And she and Clive Benton head off.
They're sponsored actually by the Institute. You made this institute up, right?
I did. It's an imaginary institute of archaeology in Santa Fe. No relation to the Santa Fe Institute. That's separate. That's real. This is fake. I don't want to get sued.
So Nora, actually, the Institute sponsors to some degree, her going out there, right?
That's right. Exactly.
But we don't want to say why, because that's kind of a spoiler. So tell us who the Donners were. These wagon trains generally left St. Louis on their trek across the Great Plains and so forth, and their goal is California. And they're not going for the gold rush, they're actually going to be settlers, right?
That's right. It was in 1846, and at the time California was still part of Mexico. But it was expected that at any moment the United States would take it. And they wanted to be there when this happened to build new lives in California. But the Donners were not an ordinary group of immigrants. They were by the most part, they were wealthy, sophisticated, educated people. And they had money. And they had money with them. In fact, there was a man named Wolfinger who had a chest of gold with him. And they planned to establish businesses, to buy land, to set up stores, and so forth in California. And so this was not an ordinary group. They were quite sophisticated, and they reached a point in Wyoming where the standard trail went northward, but there was a mountebank by the name of Lansford who claimed that there was a shortcut, and oh boy, this shortcut was going to save them weeks of travel time. And so the group split up. The more conservative people decided to go on the tried and true trail, and the Donner Party and the Reed Party decided to take the shortcut and get to California a little bit quicker. Big mistake, because it turned out not to be a shortcut at all. It crossed the great salt desert where they almost died of thirst and almost starved to death. They were constantly shot at by Indians who killed their oxen and stole their horses and were very upset that they were going through their lands. And they were, so even before they got stuck in the Sierras and snowed in, they were in really serious shape. The wagon train had suffered a breakdown in authority and discipline as well. It become almost like the Lord of the Flies, really. I mean, there were arguments, there were fights, people were not in charge. A man was murdered. Another man was put out of the wagon train to die on the side of the trail. Things were at a very bad pass, even in Utah, before they even got into California.
You can imagine the recriminations that happened. I told you we should have turned left at the Howard Johnsons.
This navigation program never works.
Well, I did point out to Doug when we were talking earlier that because these people, that there was a series of really bad decisions they made that got them into the final mess. But because they had more money and they had maybe thought of themselves as more sophisticated, more elite and so forth, I don't think that the thought of failure or of real tribulation occurred to them. They were basically trying to take it easy and short circuit their trip, right?
That's right, yeah,
they didn't want to do the hard slog.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, if you are taking women and children and animals and all your worldly possessions with you, why wouldn't you want to stick with the whole group, which would be safer when there are Indians shooting at you, and take the trail that would get you there, that everybody knew would get you there? What on earth possessed them to do this thing?
There was a little girl in the party named Patty Reed, and the children were not allowed to bring any toys because there just wasn't room in the wagon train. But she smuggled her doll into her dress, into the folds of her dress, and was able to smuggle it onto the wagon train. And that doll survived, and it can be seen in the museum at Sutter's Mill. But she survived, and she was 13 years old, feisty girl. And after she had survived, after she had gotten out of this terrible situation, they asked her, "Well, do you have anything to say? What do you have to say?" She said, "I do. Don't take no shortcuts and hurry along." And and it's kind of a philosophy of life, isn't it?
So Lincoln was
I mean,
Gibson's
I think
diary.
that when you're out there on this wagon train, and every single day, presents potentially mortal dangers. Your axles could break, somebody could get sick. And I think there are some people who, by the time they got to this mountebank that Doug was talking about, they were desperate enough to take the chance. Not all of them did it, but I could see, for people who weren't used to that kind of travel, how the idea of this miraculous shortcut could certainly be tempting.
Is the diary that you referred to a real thing, or did you make it up?
Well, the diary is real. There are many, many instances of people remarking on how Tamzine Donner religiously kept this diary even in the darkest times when they were dying of starvation, and she only stopped writing it when she herself died of starvation and was eaten by a man named Keseberg, who became known afterwards as he survived, and he became known as the human cannibal, and he was a very unsavory character. They found pieces of Tamzine Donner in a big iron pot in this campsite. But so we know that the journal, she kept a journal, and historians would absolutely love to get their hands on that journal, but it has not surfaced yet, except in our novel.
And boy, did we have fun making it up.
We hope they don't find the journal tomorrow. That would really be that would kind of ruin our novel.
Boy, that would be a bummer. So, Lincoln, you're a well-read person. Do you remember reading a book called The Life of Pi, which was a huge bestseller a while back?
The Life of Pi?
Mm-hmm.
I thank you for saying I'm a well-read person. I'm about to give the lie to that because I have not read that book, although I've heard about it. Why do you ask?
Well, I asked because I didn't actually read the book, but I saw the movie. Confession. But wait, there's a point to this, which is this guy is shipwrecked, and as he sails along, he has a tiger on board, and he has that's Pi, long conversations with the tiger, which really comes across very well the way the movie did it. And when he gets to his destination, what you realize is that the tiger, in fact, symbolized the fact that to survive, the guy ate his fellow people in the boat. And the tiger was his way of dealing with that fact that he was doing that. It's a very powerful book, but amazingly, it applies to this one. So I thought of it because I can see the movie. I can see the boat and the guy, and then the tiger, this kind of cartoon character in the background, and you realize that he is there, as a metaphor for cannibalism, how to survive in really desperate situations. The Donners are not the only people that resorted to it.
Well, the cannibalism was not on.
There's a fascinating image of the tiger, and you're right. It occurs in lots of literature, true and fiction. I mean, look at Edgar Allan Poe's story, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which Doug and I both love. That, among many other depravities that are described in that book, is cannibalism, and on the high seas, it's
cannibalism.
It's frightening.
Now, cannibalism on the high seas was not infrequent, and in fact, sailors had. This is true. It's horrible, but it's true. Sailors had a word for it, for human beings who died and then were going to be eaten. They called them long pig.
Long pig.
Because apparently, it tastes like pig, pork.
You didn't test that out, did you?
No, I haven't.
Is that right, Doc?
Long pig cracklings. Delicious. Sorry, you read our books, so this is the kind of horror that we've been subjected to as our readers.
Well, but it's
Doug wrote that book called Cities of Gold, and they started out with 3 people, but when they came to the end of the trail, there were only 2 left. He never really talked about that happened.
I gained weight on that trip. I don't know how.
Well, it's easy to talk about this sensational aspect of it, and that's what most people think of when they think of the Donner Party. But there's way much more to the story, and I should mention that the story is framed at the beginning by a chapter or two, which is about grave robbing. And I'll leave it there, but it does, in fact, play into the entire story. So you've got a lot of science in this book, the two of you. You drew on various aspects of things you've written about before in order to make this book work, didn't you?
And there's some science we can't tell you anything about because that would be a terrible
Total
spoiler. But we combined this whole thing with another idea that Lincoln and I, for 15 years, have been mulling over and trying to figure out how to turn this idea into a book. And it just blended so perfectly with the idea of the cannibalism at Donner Pass.
So how many of you have been to the Sierra Nevadas? Have any of you? A lot of you probably have. Am I right in thinking that the Sierras are far steeper on the east side and that they slope more gently down into California? That's my memory of the Sierras, but I haven't driven them for quite a long time. But that plays into this because the Donner Party almost made it to the pass, but they decided to stop and wait for the snowstorm to dissipate, and then they decided to give it a day to melt, whereas if they had persevered, I think it was a much more gentle downhill slope from the pass into California, and they very likely would have survived. But my geography might be at fault here. I just thought of this afternoon, so I haven't looked it up. Does anybody know from their own experience that, because the way the mountains are formed by the Pacific Plate pushing up, I tend to think that, they've worn down more on the western side and they're steeper on the eastern side. But I slept through Geology 101 at Stanford because it met at 8 in the morning one days when I used to sleep late. So I'm really very poorly qualified to make this. That's what I think happened. But you pointed out that they could have actually made it through.
Yeah, if they had, it started to snow and they thought, well, we're 3 miles from the pass, we'll just, the snow's going to stop. We'll just continue on in the morning. And if they had just pushed on that night and kept going through the night and over the pass, they're only 3 miles from the pass, the front of this wagon train. Then it would have been downhill all the way into the, below the snow line. And it wouldn't have been that far. They would have been able to do it.
As I said, it was a lot of bad decisions. But Doug said he thinks that the whole social structure of this wagon train had broken down by the time this happened to them, and there was nobody really in charge.
That's right. Yeah, it was a Lord of the Flies situation.
All right. So you guys like this well enough to think about writing a sequel?
You mean the one that we're halfway done with?
Just asking.
Well, Lynn, tell everyone a little bit about the next book. Tell everyone about the next book.
Well, okay, I will begin to, and then you stop me if I tell too much. We definitely.
That's enough.
Somebody turn his microphone on. We wrote Old Bones definitely with the idea that this was going to be the beginning of a series. It was going to sort of, getting crew was going to yield the stage to Nora and Corey. And so even before Old Bones was finished, we were looking at another idea that could possibly involve Nora as our archaeologist and Corey as an FBI agent out of the Albuquerque office. And what we found involves things. You can't tell anybody this, okay? All things exactly like.
Lincoln, if you can hear us,
He did that on purpose.
Lincoln, your sound is turned off. Say something.
What?
Well, we missed your latest pearl of wisdom. Would you care to repeat it?
Yeah, the story is so exciting that, I think there are people in the government that don't want us to tell anybody about it. And what happened in the story is that it was a close thing. So.
Oh, you are so close.
More than that,
I think, Barbara, you better go to the next question.
Or we've been hacked. I'm not sure. Maybe the FBI is listening in, or the CIA or something. Right. So you started this with the intention. You're still in the Penderverse. You've taken Nora and you've taken Corey, but there's some other characters too that have appeared in the whole world of Pendergast. Are you going to filter any more of them into maybe this series as you go along?
Well, it's kind of interesting because Corey and Nora have never met. They don't know each other. They don't know that the other one knows Pendergast. So at the end of this novel, Old Bones, Pendergast makes a cameo appearance, much to the astonishment of these two women, and I better not say any more except to say it's quite a chapter. He makes a big impression on everybody, way up there in the mountains. It's quite amazing what he does.
So how did he get there from Florida?
How did he get there from Florida? I guess Proctor drove him in his rolls. No, I don't know. I guess he flew.
Well, I'm asking because aren't you going back to Florida for the next Pendergast?
He is going back to Florida. That's right. Yeah. He has to go back to Florida to testify in front of the grand jury from the Verses for the Dead. Which have you all read Verses for the Dead? Well, we don't show these sorts of things in our books, but FBI agents, they have to spend a lot of time in court testifying and filling out paperwork and that sort of thing. So he has to return to Florida to testify in front of a grand jury, and another case comes down, and he doesn't want to take it, but eventually he sort of reluctantly takes this case. And that's going to be our next Pendergast novel, which is called Crooked River. And that will be published in February of next year.
We get to do this all over again on February 4th. Yay. So mark your calendar. Right. Crooked River. So, Lincoln, I'm assuming that you didn't journey from Florida into the snowy Sierras and back. You left that part up to Doug, right?
Yes, Doug was happy to do it since he could ski down that easy slope into California you were mentioning. And I had to stay in Florida and do the really difficult work of writing the book after he sent me his notes.
So can you update us on what's going on with your enigmologist? Because we haven't seen him for a little while.
Well, that's sort of the nature of an enigmologist. He pops up when you least expect it. Barbara's referring to Jeremy Logan, the series character in my solo novels, and he is very hard at work on a very topical subject, and I tried to frame the book around my earlier book, Deep Storm, in the sense of menace and a very strange, unusual, exotic location. And unfortunately, I can't tell you anything more, even the name, because the name gives the whole story away. But you'll see him sooner rather than later, Barbara. Thank you for your interest.
No, I hope you're not working too hard on this novel here, Lincoln.
Well, I'm excited. I really like the entomologist books, and Lincoln has always been kind enough to sign them and send them to us, so I'm assuming that he will again. I think they're a lot of fun. So, Doug, you had an absolute score with The Lost City of the Monkey God. I'm hoping that if any of you missed it, you will not miss it, because it's such a wonderful book. And just recently, your 1995 book, Talking to the Ground, was republished. If you missed it, in June, we still have copies up there. Tell us a little bit about that one, because it's such a gem.
Well, thank you. That was my third book, I think. But it was it takes place in mostly in Arizona. It's a true story of, well, I got on a horse with my fiancée, who's now my wife, and her 9-year-old daughter, and we rode a month around the Navajo Indian Reservation, just following the route, the mythical route of a Navajo god called Monster Slayer. And so I wrote a book about that, about the whole Navajo creation story, the journey, and all the rest of it. So, and it was just reissued with a new afterword that I wrote for the book, bringing it up to date.
It's really must reading for Hillerman fans as well as for Doug Preston fans, because, as you know, Tony writes about the Navajo, but an awful lot of his books are New Mexico center, and this one, the Four Sacred Peaks of the Navajo, are kind of the corners of the territory that you write about.
That's right, yeah.
Plus, there's some tremendous horseback riding, and we agreed that both of us are probably too old to even think about 10 weeks on horseback anymore. Not that I ever did, but you have.
Well, yeah, I did that many years ago. So.
And are you thinking of another nonfiction book?
Well, I've got some ideas I'm working on, but nothing yet. I've got 2 ideas that might bear fruit. Really spectacular ideas, but you know, good nonfiction stories don't come along, and you don't want to force it. You don't want to just write about something just because you have to write the next book. It's not like a novel where you can pull something out of thin air.
Just make shit up? You can't do that. That was the word you were striving for, right?
I was trying to be polite.
There we
took
go.
the words right out of my mouth.
Right. So, Lincoln, we're going to probably move to questions for the audience, but is there anything else you'd like to say about Old Bones?
Yes, there was one thing I'd like to say, and that is I was signing all your copies in New York City about 6 weeks ago, and in one of those, in Grand Central's offices on 6th Avenue, in one of those tall buildings, all looked the same in the 50s. And all of a sudden, there was this alarm that came over the building. Everybody, please leave the building. You know, 14th floor to 40th floor first. We're shutting down the electricity. You know, the fire marshal is shutting us down. Take the stairs or the designated elevators. And I looked around at everybody else, and they looked at me. And we said, Elizabeth, you know, Barbara's not going to accept it if you don't sign these books.
How right they were.
I stayed there throughout, you know, this emergency until the last day signed.
That's how terrifying.
Life and limb. Too.
That's how terrifying Barbara is. She looks nice. She looks nice. She's scary when she doesn't get.
And so, you know, it's not all beer and Skittles, as they say. You know, I mean, sometimes we risk our lives to bring these signed books to you.
Well, they're actually for your fans. They just pass through our hands, but I'm sure they appreciate your heroic efforts. We've been doing this since 2012, and out of this, they've had 3 #1 bestsellers. And then Doug had separately Talking to the Ground was one, so, and Lincoln's been on the list. So it's been a very successful partnership, hasn't it?
It really has. Barbara has supported my writing career since the
Since your first book. No, second book.
my second book since for 30 years now.
Yeah.
Through 4 different
Yeah,
bookstores,
very
right?
Well, it's all one bookstore
Very
with different
successful.
locations, right?
Three-way partnership, I would say.
Well, how about if you guys take questions from the audience? Lincoln can't actually see them, so you're going to need to MC this there.
Good. All right. I'm in control here. Yes.
I have a
Good.
question about the email short story you sent us about Bertrand and the fact that it was predated. And is there going to be a follow-up book on that?
Lincoln, the question for you is regarding the short story about Monsieur Bertin. Is there going to be a follow-up novel about that?
Okay, I'm happy to answer that. Thank you for the question. We always try to make sure that our newsletters are not just, puff pieces where we talk about what we're doing next or where our book is on the list or who's reviewed us recently, but give our readers something interesting and unusual that you can't get if you're not a subscriber. And in this case, we decided to give them an entire short story about a character who appeared in one of our books, Monsieur Bertin, tutor of Pendergast. And
Diogenes.
does suggest it. Shut up, please. This was meant for newsletter subscribers only, but that's always very difficult, as we found with our ongoing Blackout Society stories, because people who join the newsletter after a certain point want, understandably, to get the earlier stories. And this is particularly important in the case of Bertin's story because something really shocking and important to the whole Pendergast arc of his story is revealed. And I think we're going to have to retell part of the story in a future Pendergast book in order to make that part of the canon. Because it's so surprising what happens in the final paragraphs of the story.
So how many people here collected your free short story? Everyone? Well, you should do that. Open up. I think in our next newsletter, we're going to have directions on how you can get that free short story. So.
That was awesome.
All right. Any more questions? Yes, sir.
Is it a prerequisite to be fluent in French before beginning Old Bones?
I guess speaking a little French might help. Yes. Well, I mean, of course, the first chapter is set in Paris, right before Notre Dame burned. Because in that first chapter you can see Notre Dame, and there's no scaffolding, and the roof spire is still there. So, but that's I think that's the only chapter where there's a lot of French, isn't that right? Or
There's some profanity I didn't quite understand.
profanity. Link, you're the expert in profanity.
No, I'm not the expert, but I'm the one who happened to have to write that first chapter. So it is profanity in it. I apologize, and if you can find me, I'll pay you back for the book. But good luck with that.
Profanity always sounds so much better in French.
Very true. It's very literate, right? Sacré bleu. How many people actually would say that? But then the British say bloody, and that doesn't really mean anything outside their cultural context. So,
Espèce de merde.
you want to translate that literally, right?
In Riptide, we made up a French swear word, and I don't know if it's a real one or not, but it's very descriptive and colorful, and nobody's ever called us on it, so maybe it actually exists.
Not even our French readers.
I'm not going to repeat it. it was amusing.
Any other questions? Yes.
I had a question for you. It revolves around Carrie Swanson a little bit. I was thinking that the characters in your novels, one of the nice things about fictional characters is they don't have to get older. You know, they can kind of stay the same age. I don't really think of Pendergast as being a lot older, even though the book's been around a long time. But when you introduce somebody like Carrie that started so young and is getting older and more experienced now, do you ever think about that or what that means?
Your characters are aging at different
I
rates.
know. Well, you know, in the Pendergast universe, everyone else gets older except for Pendergast and Constance. And there
Even
may
the
actually be
authors.
an explanation for that. What's that?
I said even the authors are definitely.
I know, unfortunately. Oh my God, we are getting older. Poor Link.
I actually kept track. In a very anal way, I kept track of the timeline of the first 10 or 12 Pendergast books, and saw that 20 years of real life had passed, and only about 10. And it soon got so complicated, I eventually gave up, and we'll leave it to the scholars who write dissertations on us 50 years from now to figure that out.
It's mentioned in Relic, I don't know if you remember that far back, that Pendergast was in Vietnam during the war. Some kind of secretive special forces. Well, if that were true, he'd be in his 70s now. So he's still 41. So I don't know how that happened.
He's a child detective.
Child detective.
If you remember, Spencer by Robert
I know.
Parker was a Korea War veteran, and somehow he survived up until Bob died in 2009 or whatever, and Spencer was still hitting the bag and the whole bit. So I think we all just conspire not to let our favorite characters get too old.
Well, we actually wrote a epilogue, The Cabinet of Curiosities, a book that deals with an elixir that greatly slows down aging. And we decided in the end to take that epilogue out, but that doesn't mean to say it didn't actually happen. And if it didn't, it would go along with what explaining why Pendergast seems so spry.
So there's such a short supply that only Pendergast and Constance have access to the elixir, right, and everybody else doesn't. Too funny. Anybody else have a question? Yes?
What are some of your favorite authors or books that you read for fun and inspiration?
What are some of our favorite authors? Well, I think authors that influenced me when I was young. Obviously, Conan Doyle is a big influence. Lovecraft, M.R. James, who wrote those wonderful ghost stories. I love ghost stories, and I think probably Link would say that probably have the similar list of authors that influenced him, which is maybe why we work so well together in a partnership. Who are some of your authors?
Yeah, I think Doug and I probably read the same syllabus almost when we were young, without even knowing it. Among the more recent authors that I think we both really like include Michael Crichton's early work and Thomas Harris's early work and Dennis Lehane's Shutter Island. We've learned a lot about pacing and how to write action from those stories. Although Doug was given a lesson on how to write fight scenes that is really quite interesting. I don't know if you want to repeat that or not, but
well, it was that British author. What's his name? He wrote The Eye of the Needle. Ken Follett. So I was talking to him at a writers' conference, and he said, well, he's a very small. Well, not small, but he's very British, and he's not a tough guy at all, Tweedy, But so he had to write a book, and there had to be a brutal fight scene in the book. And so he was like, oh my God, how am I going to do this? I've never been in a fight in my life. I always ran like hell from fights. So he made a list of all the things that two people could do to hurt each other, you know, biting the ear, gouging out the eye, kicking in the balls, you know, all this stuff, you know, scratching, you know, pulling hair. And then he looked at this list and he said, okay, let's put it in logical order. So he put it in order. And then he wrote the fight scene, basically, you know, putting all this in order. And he turned in the novel, and he was sure that the publisher was going to say, oh, you weenie, you have no idea what a fight is like. This is terrible. But it was just the opposite. The publisher, his editor, said, Ken, this is amazing. I had no idea you were a fighter. Holy moly. This is the best fight scene I've ever read. Man, you really, I mean, this is definitely, you must have been in a lot of fights as a kid. And then at the end of the story, Ken said,
it was so successful. He used the same technique in his sex scenes, which is why they take 20 pages.
No, Link is not kidding. That's what he said. He said, and I then used the same technique in writing my sex scenes. You just have to make a list.
Where did he get his checklist for the sex scenes?
You make a list and you put it in logical order, and then it just all flows from there.
This discussion's deteriorating, right? Anyone else have a question?
There's a lot of research on 42nd Street.
I have a question for Link, and that is about the memoirs of your grandmother. Is there any reason why you didn't publish those beyond your family? It sounds fascinating.
Thank you for saying so. It's because I felt that I didn't really have, she was very secretive about them during her life, and she was always working on them, and always, I'd get to read them eventually. I got to read all her novels and her, like she wrote a nonfiction book about Sir Henry Layard, and I got to read that, but she would never let me see this. And I don't know if it was because she was embarrassed or because she felt that she never really, had a finish to the story. She was in Israel during the Yom Kippur War, and that frightened her so much that she didn't go back very often for more digs. That was happening in the place where she was doing a lot of her archaeological work. But I just felt that it was a family project, and but someday I may decide to see if I could send Memoirs of an Amateur Archaeologist to our agent and see if he thinks there's a wider audience for it.
That's a great title, actually. Memoirs of a Damaged Archaeologist. They're great. And she wrote about Masada, did you say?
Yes, she was part of the dig. The fellow, I can't remember the name of the fellow who was running it. He did not want her anywhere nearby, but because she was an artist, she was able to sneak into the team doing sketches. And slowly she insinuated her way into the actual archaeological work that was going on.
My favorite, James Missionary.
While they were finding, which way the Roman ramp had been constructed, et cetera, et cetera.
If you haven't read it, Michener's novel *The Source* is in fact about Masada. It's the only Michener I ever actually finished because they're really big books and I would get bored. But Masada, I thought that he took it from like prehistoric times all the way up. It was absolutely fascinating. So I think there would be a real interest in somebody writing about Masada. I really do. So, let's thank our authors for coming to see us this evening.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Lincoln, it's always a pleasure. And could I tell you that February in Scottsdale would be actually maybe even more fun than February in Florida? Just a thought. Just one
I'd love to
time.
be there in person, and I want to thank you for being such a gracious hostess and being so helpful to us and to your bookstore patrons. You've really made a huge difference to Pendergast and us. So thank you, and thanks to all of you who listened and who asked such insightful questions.
Thank you.
And thank you, Doug, too.
Thank you, partner.
You bet. Yes, sir. Did you say
You got it.
Just one last thing for Lincoln. Could you play us something on that guitar behind you?
Yes, Lincoln, play the guitar. It's a banjo. Is it a banjo or a guitar? Oh, it's a guitar. Okay.
I can't get out of my chair. Yes?
Yeah.
This is really hard. This is actually a cheesy guitar that I sold my house in Morristown, and I'm in an undisclosed location nearby, and my office is so Spartan, I thought I'd decorate it with this Ibanez guitar that wasn't very expensive, but was nicely built and was only available for 7 months. And something about the blue color of it really inspired me. So I'm the man with the blue guitar.
That's very poetic.
possibly even a book title?
Picasso puff.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lincoln. It was memorable. So, were you saying goodbye?
I figured if I played something bad enough, I wouldn't ever get asked again to have to do it. Thank you very much.
You
Thank
bet.
you. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Barbara.
you. Thank you to our Facebook audience. And we certainly thank all of you for coming.